All right. Thank you for joining me on this episode of The Gospel Truth. I'm your host, Marlon Wilson. And this is probably been a little bit, my last debate I had on here was Mr. Jonathan McLatchie and John Gleason, also known as a godless engineer. That was a great debate. I have another one for you today. Another great debate. Today, we're going to be debating, can atheism account for objective morality? And we've heard some recent arguments, from the likes of Tom Jump, who also argues in that fashion that they can account for objective morality. And we have another one by the name of Taylor Gray, who feels he can argue this position. But to go heads up with him is Miles Ketelsen. So it should be an exciting debate. And I'm looking forward to this one. So with that said, before we get into this, I do want to go over a couple of announcements, and so we can do some house chores. Let me see real quick. Let me bring it up for you. Hold on one second. All right, so I have next debate will be November 4th, 2019, and that will be against Rail Laster and Ricky Roldan, and the subject matter is which worldview hinders presuppositions, and that's coming up November 4th. All right, so next, this is a big one I think everybody's looking forward to, and that's Tom Jump versus Matt Slick. Everyone in the Christian community know who Matt Slick is, man, so it's going to go down. That one's going to be a big one. November 6th, so be on the lookout for that one. Also, I have coming up on November 19th, I have Alex D against Mark Stanley. And this is an interesting one. This is not the first time we argue this subject, why I am and why I'm not a Christian. So that should be a fun one to look out for. So I'm pretty excited for that one. And lastly, we have Dr. Gregory Yancey, and he's going to be coming on it's going to be an interview. He's going to come on and talk to me about discrimination against Christians in academia. So he does a lot of work in this area from a scholarly perspective. So it'd be interesting to see what he has to say on this subject matter. So be on the lookout. That's just the first 4 shows that are coming up. And I have shows all the way up to next year, I believe, to the end of February. So there's a lot of content coming up. So be on the lookout for that information. Once again, if you can take time to go ahead and like and follow The Gospel Truth, if you could take time to share this content, I would totally appreciate it. I need your guys' help to get this information out there, to get this information to those who need to hear it. So as you know, the Gospel Truth, we are engaging culture with Christian truth. And with that, we do that through debates, interviews, and Bible lessons. So just if you could, go ahead and share this content, get it out there. So we not only can, glorify God and what we do, but so people can be saved. That's the whole goal of this content, is to save and to train the body of Christ. So we want to make sure that we're getting this stuff out there. But with that said, I'm going to slightly introduce the two debaters, the two participants in this debate. I got Miles Ketelsen. I think I put a filler out there in Reform Pub, I believe, or something like that. And Miles hit me up. He's like, man, if you need somebody, I'm down. That's all for sure. Okay, I got you, Miles. All right. So Miles jumped on here and said, if you can get somebody that's willing to debate, I'm down. So, ever since then, had him on the board to debate, got him hooked up with Taylor Gray. And I met Taylor Gray. I watched some of his videos on YouTube. And I said, man, he might be able to hold his weight. So I figured I'd bring him on and send him an invite. He graciously accepted the invite, and we're ready to go. We're ready to do this. So, but that's where I'm going to end. I'm going to allow these guys to come in and introduce themselves. And then once they do that, we'll go to the debate format. So first up, I'm bringing Miles, and Miles can go ahead and introduce himself and do your thing, Miles.
Yeah, so my name is Miles, and I'm a graphic designer by trade, but I am an evangelist by calling. So I don't have too much to say. I'm not a theologian by any means. I'm not a seminary grad or anything like that. I'm just passionate about the gospel, and I'm happy to be here.
All right, am I on? I'm Taylor. I have a channel on YouTube called Snake Was Right. And most of my content lately has been focusing on creationism or just in general atheism debates. But I have started out kind of with the historical type of stuff and going after Islam a little bit. I'd like to kind of circle back around to that kind of content eventually. But yeah, I love debating theism and just talking about biology in general. Yeah, I am an atheist, and that will be relevant for today's debate. And I guess that's it for introduction. Let's just get right into it.
All right, fellas. So this is how we're going to do this. The format is 10-minute openings, and then we're going to go into cross-examination. It's going to be a 60-minute examination. So both parties get about 30 minutes to cross-examine each other. After 10 minutes expire, I would transition to the next person and so forth until the full expiration of 60 minutes. After that, we'll have a 5 to 10 minute closing, however long you guys want to take with that. And then if there are questions at the end of that, we'll throw those questions at you and see where that goes. Y'all good with that?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Marlon, I'm going to mute my mic while he does his, so that way when I take notes, you're not getting sound in the feedback from the keyboard.
All right, for sure. All right. So Taylor Gray, you are arguing the affirmative, so you got it first. All right.
All righty. Just gonna share my screen real quick. Let's see. Okay. All right, is that working? Can you see my screen? Should be working. Okay. So what is morality? We're gonna have to define that today to even get to what is objective morality and whether or not an atheist system can account for that. So what is it? And morality is just the question of right or wrong or good and bad behavior. But we're going to have to define that very painstakingly, in my opinion, even though it is fun to do. So essentially, what we're going to have to be able to do is create an ethics system. And ethics is just a system of defined moral values and principles, or basically recommendations pertaining to morality. You can create an ethical system just by listing out rules, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's valid. And we'll talk about what makes something valid or invalid. And immorality is simply the violation of this ethical code, especially a valid ethical code. And just that qualifies what is bad. So what is objective morality? So my goals today is to define an ethical system that is both internally and externally consistent, i.e. consistent with logic and observable reality, as well as not contradictory within its own framework, not self-refuting, essentially. And to define the values of good and bad objectively as it relates to an ethical system. And I will also attempt to show that there is an imperative to follow this ethical system, meaning we should. And I'm going to say that this can be done with or without God. So it's not necessarily atheism accounting for it, but it is compatible with atheism. And I'm essentially going to be arguing from a logical perspective. So it doesn't really matter whether you have a God or you don't have a God, you're working within an atheist system. The result in the process will be the same. I wanted to touch first a little bit on argumentation ethics, which is essentially if you're in a debate, if you're having an argument, you're essentially already presupposing and admitting that the truth or just a logical argument is preferable or is better than basically just beating the other guy on the head and taking his stuff. So we can start there, and but I'm going to actually attempt to show that that's not even necessary to start there. We can start even fundamentally further. So we'll define the difference between subjective and objective. Subjective refers to personal perspective, feelings, or opinions entering decision-making processes. Objective refers to the elimination of subjective perspectives and a process that is purely based on hard facts. So a personal God's will would simply not be sufficient criteria to be objective, because that would remain contingent upon the subject, which is God. So it would be subjective. So sin being offensive to God tells us nothing about the validity or rationality of this offense. So inevitably the question is going to come back, how can we as humans question God, who's supposedly much higher in his understanding than us? So if his morality is in fact objective, then we can fact check his claims. That's the whole thing about objectivity. And secondly, we must question God, or we are susceptible to believe false gods and even the devil. So we have to check all these different claims that are being made for their rationality, essentially. Skepticism is required, or else we can believe just anything that anyone tells us. Let's see here. My position is that moral relativism is self-refuting, and it's pretty easy to demonstrate, and it defeats the whole purpose of a moral system. So it's just moral relativism is pointless. You can easily demonstrate this by it can't be consistently applied. It will give a contradictory result depending on the subject. So some people think child rape is morally valid. Some people think stopping child rapists is the morally valid position. So these are mutually exclusive, contradictory results. So that cannot be an objective ethical system. We have to have a system that gives us the same result every time for every subject. Again, morality derived from God, exclusively derived from God, is dependent on God's will and is thus subjective by definition. And I would describe that as divine command or might makes right. And objective morality is not derived from authority or might. It lies outside your ability to enforce your moral position. So it remains true regardless of whether or not you can make it happen. So essentially, if God has a position that is not able to be checked, it is objective, or it is subjective, and therefore invalid. I think we've gone over this. We must reason before being able to choose a God or being able to, God is claimed to be good. So we have to be able to analyze that claim. Or else we could just be listening to someone who claims to be good but isn't really good. Essentially, I would demonstrate this by saying, if just for a thought experiment, imagine you're in heaven talking to God. You should be able to ask him the question, and he should be able to rationally justify his moral law, or he cannot do this. He can either give good reasons for what his ethical system is, or he gives random or bad reasons. So if God has objective morality, then he will be able to justify why he says murder, for example, is wrong, and he would be able to articulate this in a rational manner. And thus, since we're able to rationalize, we would be able to do the same thought process as God has come to. This is just a logical proof of basically what I've been saying. And briefly again, just more formal logic of what I've been saying. Essentially, if you believe just because someone says he's good, that's not a good reason to believe. You have to be able to analyze whether or not he is good. So let's get down to the brass tacks of how we actually, or how I personally derive objective morality. And there are some similarities. I know you mentioned Tom Jump. I do like his terminology, the best of all possible worlds, but I kind of go down a different road than him for this. He has been criticized for not being able to measure his system, and I'm going to attempt to succeed with that. And I also have some similarities with the argumentation ethics, which we've been over, and with Stefan Molyneux's universally preferable behavior. But my criticism of that would be I would prefer to frame it more as universally applicable behavior. If anyone's familiar with Stefan Molyneux. Okay, so let's go through it. What is objective morality? The first premise is an ethical system that contradicts itself at any point is logically invalid. Premise 2, an ethical system that is internally consistent is logically valid. Objectivity is consistent with both reality and logic, and therefore any set of ethics is both internally consistent and unchanging in the face of objective impartial reality. That is a valid objective moral framework. Okay, this is where I think it gets interesting. So this is where I'm going to derive my ought from an is. And let me know whatever premises you have a problem with. And we can go back and look at them whenever. So two contradictory statements cannot be true at the same time. And something cannot ever result from nothing, and yet something exists. And so I'm going to argue that total, complete, absolute nothingness, aka total non-existence, is logically incoherent because we have something, and something cannot come from nothing, and therefore something must necessarily ought to exist. And this is not to say that just because something is, that it ought to exist, like a moral evil, but it is these are necessary existences, and some states of reality are temporary and not necessary. So things like decisions. So why should we be moral? Under a logical framework, logic incurs an imperative for concepts to adhere to the laws of reality, and there are logical and illogical states of existence. Objective morality or ethics is and should be logical, or else it's self-refuting. And therefore, the imperative is toward logical states of existence. This logical system is what we call ethics. So here's where I'm going to define good and bad. And so we don't actually need argumentation ethics, but I put it in there anyway. So starting with the second premise, some propositions are universally applicable, such as logic, science, mathematics, and argumentation ethics. And I also wanted to touch briefly on the veil of ignorance, which removes subjectivity from studying any type of ethical system, because for people who don't know, applying the veil of ignorance means that you basically don't know which position you're going to be born into society, and what society would you design around knowing that, because it would be fair. So the next premise is something is universally preferable to nothing. Something over non-existence has objectively higher quantity of objective qualities or properties than nothing. So the way we use the word good is kind of subjective. It's kind of based on opinion, having qualities require, or I guess more objectively, it would be, what is this good for? Does it have the qualities required for a particular role? And or it's something to be preferred, but that is, again, subjective. So I think we can use the term good in consistently with its English definition and define it as something which causes a system to be of objectively higher quantity of qualities or properties than the baseline. And in the case of the first example that we're deriving an ought from and is from, it's existence versus non-existence. So basically, why should we care? Logic incurs an imperative for concepts to adhere to the laws of reality. If you write a system of logic, you should follow that, because that's just how logic works if it's valid. Premise 2, the universe cannot not exist and therefore ought to exist. We've been over this. Premise 3, objective good is defined as an objectively higher quantity of qualities than the baseline position. And I expect we'll probably have some arguments over this particular premise. Premise 4, existence has objectively higher quantity of qualities than non-existence and is therefore better, using this definition, than nothing and non-existence, and therefore good ought to exist, because existence itself is a logical imperative for good. It is, the universe objectively prefers that over non-existence. And so where does that get us? How can we actually start applying this theory? And that would be when we can define freedom as the first fundamental moral value. That which is good has objectively higher quantity of qualities than the baseline or point of comparison. And the more properties or qualities a system or object has, the more possible positions and configurations the system has. And freedom is a spectrum of possibilities. The more possible configurations a system can potentially hold, especially simultaneously, the more freedom the system has. The fewer, the more constrained. The more possible configurations a system can potentially hold, especially simultaneously, the higher the quantity of qualities that system has. Conclusion, therefore, freedom can be equated to objective good, and good can be equated to existence. And essentially, unpacking that would be freedom is the existence of potentials and just more existence, essentially, just to kind of put it simply. Let's see, we'll get into this a little bit later. Not sure how much time I have left, but I wanted to point out how the alternative is just nonsensical. So I'm going to bring up the problem of evil, because I think it's very important in that the Christian system is not a moral system or a moral alternative to something that I just described. So one of the common objections would be sin, and God needs to, the system is bad, or suffering happens because sin entered the world, essentially. So I'm going to say that the judgment or salvation, it doesn't even account for sin. The only relevant information in God's judgment is in which God you believed in. So the Christian system only excuses and encourages sin by giving you a basically non-moral way to avoid moral judgment on any evil except for which God you believed in. And Christianity is the perfect system for getting away with moral atrocities. It's the kind of system a psychopath would set up to essentially cover his bases and get out of jail free card, just by having the correct God. And even that is a problem because of divine hiddenness, and no one can really ever agree on which God is the true God. The next common objection is God made you; He can do what He wants to you, and I think this is very easily demonstrated that might does not make right. First of all, and second of all, it's a special pleading. God doesn't have some special ability that say your parents don't have. I think we can all agree that your parents should not be allowed to take you into the basement and kill you or torture you. And so God shouldn't be able to do that with us. And I think given that Christianity opposes the legal right to even terminate pregnancy on the grounds that parents don't have the right to kill their child, it's special pleading if you say that God should be exempt from this same rule. And if he is exempt from that, again, that's subjective morality, not objective. It has to be universally applicable and not change at any point for any subject. And to say that God can do whatever he wants to us is to dehumanize us and reduce us to mere objects in God's eyes. And this is not good or loving. And it just based on our moral intuition, this is not good. It's not good to dehumanize all humanity. The third, I think the final common objection would be free will. And the explanation is, well, in order to have free will, there has to be evil in the world. And my refutation to that is that we are created to flawed by God and judged thusly. So it's not our fault when we're being judged for his choices. And so it has nothing to do with free will, and there is nothing anyone can do about it. And the sin is forced upon us. And this is an argument I heard from a man named Greg Paul, and I thought it was just a great demonstration. So it's estimated about 100 billion humans have been born throughout the history of humanity. And we know that before the modern era, a couple hundred years ago, the childhood death rate was about 50%. So being generous, that's 50 billion dead kids that never made it to adulthood, never made it to the age of reason, most of which are never going to hear the gospel, never were born before the gospel. 50 billion children doomed by design to be tortured for eternity.
You have about a minute left.
Okay. He could have done so many things to avoid this. He could have designed diseases to only attack adult immune systems, all kinds of things. He could have put Bibles in the hands of every civilization from the beginning of human history, but it seems he's hiding. And just focusing on, that's just the child deaths. So this system is incompatible with free will. They aren't able to seek or even hear the gospel in many cases. And that's the only thing that will give them salvation, at least in most Christian systems that I have seen. And I think that's about it. I think I've provided enough to start a good conversation, and there we go.
All right. Thank you, Taylor, for that opening statement. All right, Miles, you got it. Don't forget to unmute your mic, man. You got it, man.
Cool. Well, thank you, Marlon, for having me, and thank you, Taylor, for being willing to debate. One of the beauties of tonight's debate is that no one is pretending neutrality. So Taylor has clearly made a profession of worldview, and I'm going to be doing the same. And so it's nice that we're not going to be pretending any sort of philosophical or theological neutrality. And I would argue that Taylor himself is actually holding to a theological position as well. So just to put it right out in the open, tonight I'll be representing and defending Jesus Christ and his gospel. Not only his gospel, but also his revelation. I'll be arguing from a position which is known as the impossibility of the contrary. So to put that simply, I'll be arguing that unless you start with the triune God of Scripture, you have no justification for objective morals. And not just morals, but truth, evidence, induction, the reliability of your senses, laws of thought, and laws of logic. So even though tonight's debate is in reference to morality, we'll both be making truth claims. We'll both be appealing to evidence. We'll both be utilizing the laws of thought, laws of logic. We'll both be assuming the reliability of our senses, all of which have no basis or justification outside of God. So Taylor said a lot of things there, which I know that this period isn't time to respond to the opening statements. I hope we can get into some of those things, but we've already seen a lot of those things utilized. We heard him talk about logic. We heard him talk about the evil atrocities of God and theodicy and those sorts of things. So I hope we can get into those a little bit more. But mind you, the debate topic tonight is, can atheism account for objective morality? It's not the atrocities of the Bible. It's not, is the God of the Bible an evil moral monster? It's not even, does the God of the Bible exist? The thesis and the affirmative tonight is, can atheism account for objective morality? So my challenge to the viewer would be this: examine what each of us profess tonight and see if it's consistent with what we claim to be standing on. We're both assuming worldviews. We have platforms that we're standing on. Neither of us are pretending to be neutral. You've heard the platform that Taylor stands on. So examine the platform that we're standing on and see if what is coming out of our mouth is consistent with that platform that we're standing on. Is one side being arbitrary, or both sides being arbitrary? After all, the topic of the debate is, can atheism account for objective morality? And one thing I'd like to get at a little bit later, maybe when we get into the cross-examination, is, Taylor, I'd like to see where you got your definition of objective morality from. I wasn't able to find that definition anywhere, but maybe you can point me to where that is. So we should all agree that if a worldview isn't consistent, then it should be abandoned. So throughout the discussion tonight, ask yourself two things. Is this person being consistent with their foundational beliefs about the world? And whose worldview can account for immaterial, abstract truths such as morality, logic, the consistency and reliability of your senses, etc. So for example, what I've seen from Taylor's YouTube channel, he professes to believe that we live in an unguided, objectively purposeless cosmos that our ancestors at one time were water-dwelling creatures. We evolved from societies of highly evolved bacteria that were fundamentally bags of stardust as a result of random chance mutation over billions of years. This is the fundamental platform that Taylor stands on. I'm going to challenge this platform throughout the debate tonight, as I hypothesize that Taylor will profess tonight, what he professes tonight will not be consistent with the platform that he stands on. I'll also hypothesize that he's going to borrow capital from my worldview to try and argue against it. We've already seen that. Taylor appealed just now to a standard of ethics or morality as though the God of the Bible not revealing himself to all people in a salvific sense, as if that's some sort of evil or atrocity. And I'd like to know what standard Taylor's appealing to when he says that. I'm going to hypothesize that he'll appeal to things such as absolutes and immaterial transcendental. So things like logic, absolute standards of ethics and morals. We've already seen that. I hypothesize that when challenged on morals, he'll act as though human beings are made in the image of God, not highly evolved bags of stardust. We already saw that. His tail end of his opening statement there, he appealed to pulling on our heartstrings, talking about child death. So what? In an atheistic worldview, that's just what happens. That's not consistent. It's inconsistency. He's borrowing from my worldview, and he's acting as though human beings are made in the image of God. I hypothesize that he'll engage in utilizing immaterial laws of logic and reason that don't comport with the naturalistic worldview he professes to stand on. And I'd argue that this is because Taylor, like all human beings, is made in the image of God. There's certain inescapable truths that God has innately placed within us that are so interwoven into our being that we can't help but evidence them. This is what Romans 1 talks about when it talks about all people knowing God. It's in a general sense. It's not a salvific sense. It's that we evidence this knowledge of God when we see, for example, if a woman in a park, if I was walking through a park and I saw a man on top of a woman beating her, I would run over there and immediately stop that and report him to the authorities. Why would I do that? Because I know within me, no one had to tell me that that's wrong. God has written that on my heart, on my conscience, and my conscience is pricked when I see something like that. So Taylor was evidencing that he knows that same thing when he appealed to child death. So this is part of God's design ultimately. Furthermore, my position tonight is simple. I affirm clearly that without the triune God of Scripture as your foundational starting point, you have no basis for objective morals. He's the starting point. God is not somebody or something that you reason to. He's someone that you cannot reason without. That's the position I'm going to be taking. So not just morals, but also the previously stated truths, whether knowingly or unknowingly, that we engage in. So things like logic, things like rationality, things like the uniformity of nature, induction, all of those things. So when it comes to morals, the Christian has a consistent objective framework and foundation to justify moral absolutes. The claims are rooted in the claims are not rather rooted in personal preference, but the law of God. God's law is the plumb line by which we have a basis for calling something morally reprehensible or not. This law is a direct revelation of God's character. It's directly linked to his ontos, which means it's directly linked to his being. So when Taylor said that it's something to do with his God's opinion and we need to be able to check that, that's not the Christian position. The Bible says that immorality is the opposite of God's character. So it has to do with his ontos. It has to do with his being. Anything that is against God's being or his nature is by definition immoral. It's not something subjective that God has said. So it isn't arbitrary, even on God's part. Rather, it's rooted in his very nature. So for example, stealing is wrong, not because God has arbitrarily said stealing is wrong. Stealing is wrong because God is not a thief. So by definition, stealing is wrong because it's the opposite. God is not a thief. So that makes thievery immoral. It's not something subjective that God has just arbitrarily said. So I know many atheists seek to live upstanding lives. So I want to make it clear, I'm not saying that atheists are not moral people. What I'm saying is that the atheist is inconsistent with the platform that they claim to stand on. I know lots of atheists that live or seek to live rather upstanding lives. I just think that they're living inconsistent because God has placed within them a knowledge that all people have, that there is one true God, that we've suppressed the truth against him, and we suppress that in ultimately our sin. So I'll say this again, this is going to be my last thing here. I challenge viewers on both sides, Christian and atheist alike. Remember the platforms that each side is standing on. For this whole debate, stop and ask yourself, is the claims that this person is making consistent with the platform that they're standing on? Is what is coming out of our mouths consistent with what we claim is our worldview? This debate is about more than intellectual gymnastics and just lofty conversations. It's really about the blueprint and DNA of life. And really what's more important is this underlying truth, that God himself entered into creation in the person of Jesus Christ. He lived a perfect and sinless life. He bore the sins of all those that would believe, and he rose from the dead, proving that his sacrifice was sufficient. And he didn't just die to save sinners now. Lots of Christians, lots of people think Jesus died to save me, to take me to heaven one day. And that is extremely true. It's valid. But that's not the only reason that Jesus died. One of the many beauties of Christ is that he didn't just die to save your soul. He also rescues your mind. He allows for you to be actually consistent with the worldview that you profess. And with that, Marlon, I will concede the rest of my time. I think I'm right at 10 minutes anyways.
All right. Thank you for that opening statement. Appreciate you. All right. So now we're into our cross-examination portion of this debate. Once again, it'll be a total of 60 minutes. Each party will get 30 minutes. After 10 minutes expire, we will transition to the next person. He will ask for 10 minutes and so forth and so forth.
Cool.
60 minutes totally expire. And then we'll go to closing statement. So with that said, Taylor Gray, you're up first to cross-examine Miles for 10 minutes.
If you wanted to go first, that'd be fine with me as well.
I'm fine with whatever.
All right. Yeah, go first, Miles.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I want to go. I want to go.
Okay, so I'm going to try and get to as much of this as I can. Let's see. So I didn't really hear, like I said a little bit in my opening, I didn't really hear a case for how atheism accounts for objective morality. I heard a lot of claims about Christianity. and assertions that Christianity is inconsistent. So I guess my first question would be, what's one thing that you know to be objectively wrong, and how do you know it?
I know that moral relativism is objectively wrong because it's self-contradictory.
Okay.
I know absolute nothingness is wrong because something exists.
Okay, and how do you know that?
Because it's of the law of non-contradiction.
And where does that come from in an atheistic framework?
It's self-evident.
Okay, so are you a naturalistic materialist?
Probably.
Do you essentially believe that all that exists is what you can experience through your senses?
No.
So you believe in
There's-
do you believe that human beings have a spirit?
No.
So do you believe only all that exists is the physical world?
That's all we've been able to demonstrate so far, but there are things we can measure without being able to, without the human senses, that is.
Okay, so how did you say that you know that? What was the one thing that you said that you know for certain?
Basically, anything that contradicts itself is a contradictor.
Okay, so where did the law of non-contradiction come from in the atheistic worldview?
It's just self-evident. Something cannot be what it's not.
So if I were to say it's just self-evident that God exists, he exists, would you accept that as evidence?
No, because you can't demonstrate it.
Okay, so how would you demonstrate the law of non-contradiction?
Well, this microphone is not a giraffe.
Okay, so are you utilizing your senses then to make that assertion?
Yeah.
So how do you know that your senses then are working properly?
We don't.
So you could be wrong then, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and you could too.
Well, right, but you saying that do you not see how that's contradictory? So that goes against. Well, it is, because you said that your senses could be essentially wrong about the one thing that you claim that you do know.
Yeah,
and if
but
that's the case, then claiming that I could be as well, you could be wrong about that.
Yeah, but our senses don't actually affect the law of non-contradiction at all. It works on concepts.
Right, but do you not see how you're utilizing your senses to say that?
No, because a concept doesn't use any senses.
Right, but okay, so you're assuming things like rationality, you're assuming things like logic. Yeah? You brought up logic a lot too in your opening statement too. So I guess the same as the law of non-contradiction. I know you said that it's kind of self-evident, which again it's what's called a vicious circle. So you're peeling inside of yourself. And if you could be wrong about that, then how do you know that you're right really about anything?
Well, I didn't say I could be wrong about logic. I just said I could be wrong about sensory input, because we could be in the matrix or something, but logic still exists within the matrix.
Right, but you said the one thing that you do know is that things can't contradict things, that the law of non-contradiction is valid.
Yes, it is valid.
So where does that come from in the atheistic worldview? It's a transcendental. It's something that, for example, could the universe have existed and not existed at the same time, in the same place, in the same way?
No.
Okay, so how do you account for that in an evolutionary worldview? It's a transcendent. It's not physical.
Well, this has nothing to do with evolution.
Well,
you can assume evolution is false, and the answer would still be the same.
Well, it does, because that's the foundation that you're standing on. So how does your worldview account for immaterial things like that?
Let's just assume that evolution is false for this debate, because it doesn't affect anything. It's not part of this any of my arguments here.
But it's part of your foundation. That's what you're standing on. It's one of your fundamental building blocks. I mean, it's a fundamental part of your worldview.
No, it's not a fundamental part of my worldview personally, and it's not at all a part of my arguments here. My argument is fundamentally based on logic.
Right, but
and there's
but to get to that point, there has to be underlying things that you're standing on. Neither of us are neutral right now. You have a view and a lens that you view the world through. So the real question is, who's being consistent?
Well,
so evolution has to be a part of this, because it is a part of the platform that you're ultimately standing on.
Well, I don't believe logic comes from evolution, and there are arguments that morality can come from evolution. and the way that morality evolved, our sense of morality evolved, has nothing to do with any of my arguments.
Okay, so where did the law of logic then come from in your naturalistic worldview?
It would be the same answer probably that I would give, or that you would give when I asked you where did God come from.
So you would say,
It
so
just
then
is
you would,
the fundamental.
so you would appeal to the law of logic then being a supreme being of some sort?
If you want to use the word being loosely, I suppose.
So, because the difference would be is I'm a presuppositionalist, so I would go to, or I would say that without God, we couldn't even be having this conversation right now. Would you say that then without logic, we wouldn't be able to have this conversation right now?
Yeah.
Okay, so you would say that you would equate logic to being on the same platform as God, right?
No.
Okay, so explain that.
So, I mean, if God uses logic, then he can use logic, but I don't see how you're equating God with logic.
Well, no, I'm
I'm
asking
just
you
assuming that.
because well, you said that you could pose logic to me the same way that I would say God, or
Oh, yeah.
so that's what I'm saying. So if you're going to
So,
say that, then that would be logic as your God. But even outside of that, to get back to
well, if I could explain a little bit,
okay,
I mean, I think we can both agree that there has to be a fundamental floor basis for the universe. Like, there's something there. You would think it's God, and I think it's just some sort of logical, something that is logical that perhaps defines logic itself. But
that's correct. But I would say that God is the starting point. I wouldn't say that it's something we can reason to. I would say that without God, we wouldn't even be able to have the conversation right now. So that's the difference. So that's why I was asking you, is logic then just a basal assumption that you have?
it's not so much an assumption because we can just demonstrate it self-evidently.
Right, but
It works.
okay, so this goes back to what I was saying earlier then. So in order to do that, you're using your senses. So why are you assuming the reliability of your senses? And this is again where evolution comes into play, because if you're just random chance over billions, millions of years, then how can you trust any of your senses or any of your thoughts? For all you know, your thoughts could just be mutations. They could be misfirings going off in your brain.
Yeah, but the same problem applies to any theistic proposition.
But see, in order to even make that claim, you're using your senses. You're using these abstract truths to make that claim. You could be wrong about the claim that you just made.
Yeah,
You see the
I mean, it's kind of irrelevant.
You see the folly with that?
Yeah, I mean, we could all be living in the Matrix, but we make
Right,
some
that's
fundamental
right, but
assumptions.
but that's your position. That's your position. That's not my position.
Or you
So
could be.
in order for you to be consistent, you would have to say that yes. But for me, absolutely not. There's certain things that I know for certain that I can make with absolute certainty that is consistent with the platform I stand on. So in order for you to actually be consistent, you would have to say, yeah, I could be wrong about everything I claim to know. But the problem is you do know things, but it's inconsistent with how you do know those things. And I'd make the argument, which I know it's not my time to answer whatever. I'd make the argument that that's because you're made in the image of God. But real quick, I know our time is running out here. We got 1 minute. In your discussion with SDG Apologetics about 7 months ago, you said objective morality is something that can be reasoned to. That was at the 42-minute, 52-second mark. Do you still affirm this?
Objective morality can be reasoned to? Yes.
Okay. So how do you know that your reasoning faculties, again, are working properly when you say that? And how is that objective? Because if it can be reasoned to, then how do you know that the standard that you're arriving at is actually objective? What if somebody else arrived at, oh, I don't know, we should eat our neighbor instead of love our neighbor?
Well, that would be subjective. And I went over that with the freedom position. That would diminish freedom, so that would be immoral.
Right, but says who?
Well, logic. You can reason to it.
Right.
From
So
the base position of
right, but that begs the question. So you're assuming your position without actually demonstrating it. Because what if I reason to something totally different? How do we know which one of us is correct?
Well, you can subject it to logic. I mean, we could be having our senses could be bad, but we can only work with the information that we have, no matter what position we're working with.
Right, but do you not see the folly in that? Because that means you really can't trust anything. You're essentially shooting at phantoms.
But that's not unique
Everything.
to my position.
Well, it is if you reject God, because you can't make any claims to certainty. But see, that's what I'm saying. You do actually know things. I know that you know things, but it's just inconsistent with what you claim to stand on.
All right, that's 10 minutes right there. All right, Tyler, it is your turn. 10 minutes cross-examination, Miles.
All right, so I would ask, how does God eliminate uncertainty at all?
What do you mean?
How does belief in God eliminate the uncertainty that your senses may be diluted? Like you might be hallucinating anything.
Well, no, because God has revealed things in His Word such that we can know them for certain. So God's actually designed me and designed my senses. Now, obviously, there's issues with, say, somebody who's mentally handicapped, but it's consistent with the worldview that I stand on to say that God designed me in His image. Therefore, I'm to reflect and called to rather reflect the image of God, and God is a reflection. Or rather logic, reason, rationality, those sorts of things are a reflection of God's mind.
So what if you're just imagining that?
Well, I know that I'm not, because God has spoken in His Word.
How do you know that that wasn't a hallucination?
Because God has said so.
How do you know that was really Him?
Because God has spoken.
How do you know it was God, though, is what I'm asking.
What do you mean?
It could have been someone who said, knock, knock, I'm God, but it's really the devil.
No, because God's Word has spoken about who the devil is.
How do you know that wasn't the devil?
Because I can trust my senses.
How can you trust your senses if you can hallucinate?
Well, it would probably be better to give a specific instead of just like all the hypotheticals. Like maybe what's one thing that I know?
You claim to know that it was genuinely God. How do you know that?
Well, because God has spoken in His Word and God has revealed things about Himself.
But how do you know it was God? How do you know it wasn't an imposter?
I mean, that's the answer. Because God
So
has,
it's just a circular reasoning.
Well, there shouldn't be an issue with circular reasoning from an atheistic worldview, but even so, I'm not appealing inside of myself. We're all technically in a circle, but I'm not in a vicious circle. The difference is you're appealing within yourself, and it's a circle within yourself, but you can't test anything. I'm appealing outside of myself. I'm appealing to God.
So there's a difference between a circle and self-evident. So how is it self-evident that it's God?
Well, I don't have to know how to know that God. So, for example, I don't have to know how God made a tree to know that God made a tree. So I don't know how God does every single thing that God does.
How come I can trust you when you say that, but I can't trust a Muslim or a Hindu when they say the exact same thing?
Well, are you going to become a Muslim? Because that's not really.
How am I supposed to choose? If they say the exact same thing, I've talked to them.
Well, right, but
they say God has talked to me. I know God is real because I experienced God, and they have a different God than you.
Right, but so two things. The topic of the debate is atheism, not even Christianity. The topic of the debate is, can atheism account for objective morality, not Christianity?
But aren't you arguing from the impossibility of the alternative?
I am arguing from the impossibility of the alternative.
So am I.
So you're arguing from the impossibility of.
Well, I mean, I'm doing both.
If you don't start with atheism.
Well, I'm saying that your alternative is impossible, and I'm also presenting my alternative.
Right, but you said that you could be wrong about everything that you claim to know. But back to the initial question that you were asking. Two things. The topic of the debate is atheism. The second thing is, are you going to abandon your atheism to argue for, say, the Hindu or Muslim faith? If not, then there's no need in wasting time arguing about hypotheticals.
No, because they all give me the same answer. So.
Right, and they all give you the same answer, but the difference is doing internal critiques. But we're not going to get into an internal critique of the Muslim faith right now because you're not a Muslim. So there's no need in doing that.
Well, to me, the position of Islam and the position of Christianity are equally invalid, and they're both making the same arguments.
Absolutely,
and so
absolutely
there's
not.
no distinction.
Absolutely not.
So why can't we reason without God? 2 + 2 will equal 4, whether God says so or not. We can do that without knowledge of God. We did it before the knowledge of Christianity. How can you explain that?
Because Taylor, in order to even make sense of the sentence that you're saying, you're assuming certain things that are not.
Explain that.
So when you bring up the laws of mathematics, for example, you're appealing and using things such as you're assuming the reliability of your senses, you're assuming that logic, you're assuming absolute standards of logic, not just logic, but absolute standards. You're assuming these things that atheism cannot account for. which is why the debate has to go back down to the platform and see who's consistent with what they're standing on. In atheism, I don't understand how 2 + 2 can't be anything that you want it to be.
Because if I have 1 and 1, that's 2. I can't just make it 3.
Right,
just
and
'cause I feel like it.
right, but and
God could.
right, and no, he couldn't actually, because logic is a reflection of God's mind. But how
do you know that?
Because God has revealed so in His Word.
So, so if God, so you think logic is a reflection of God's character? So
No, it's a reflection of
thievery.
God. No, it's a reflection of God's mind. Morality is a reflection of His character.
Okay, so God is not a thief or thievery is wrong because God is not a thief.
Correct.
So what if God was a thief?
Well, that's an impossible hypothetical, because God's revealed Himself in His Word, and He is what He is. That's His ontos. It's His being.
Why is He the way He is? Why did He choose to not be a thief?
I don't have the answer to that.
Does He have a good reason for that, or is it just kind of a random position that He just kind of landed? He flipped the coin and just
see that assumes certain things that are not real. It's entertaining hypotheticals.
So did He have a good reason or not?
Do you know what ontos is? There was no reason. Do you know what ontos is? His being.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if you know that, then there's no reason to ask that question, because.
So what's the reason for being? Why
There
is He the way He is?
There isn't a reason.
So it's just random.
That's literally definitional to ontos. That's like it's like we're getting at a tautology here. That's it. That's who He is by definition. That's just who He is. I don't have the answer to that. That's just who He is. That's who He's revealed Himself as.
So you can't show whether it's the real God or whether He is good or not. Or
no, I can show that it's the one true God, because He says all the other gods are idols.
Yeah, so do all the other gods.
Right. Okay. And again, this isn't a position for atheism. This isn't support for atheism. Do you want to leave that position and go to Flying Spaghetti Monster or whatever other position there is, and we can argue that? None of this is an argument for atheism, which is why I don't get why we're entertaining the hypotheticals. We can debate Baha'i, Unity, Islam, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons. We can debate all that stuff all day, but there's no point in really doing that if you're not actually going to put forth what you actually hold to. You seem to be wanting to go to, well, so-and-so says this, and so-and-so says this, and they can say this, and they can say this. And you're right, they can, and I can refute those things, but that's not what the topic of the debate tonight is.
Well, it demonstrates that you don't have an argument, because they make the same argument,
right?
And you say it's false when they do it, but your special plead, it suddenly becomes correct when you do it.
No, Taylor, I'm not. That's not what I'm saying. I can refute those positions. I can show you the internal inconsistencies. I'm not going to sit here for the next hour and a half and refute Hinduism, Mormonism, Muslims, Baha'i. I'll give you one, for example. I can show you.
I just have another question. So why isn't 50 billion kids burning for eternity? How is that consistent with your worldview? If they were never even given the chance to even hear or the gospel or reach the age of reason?
Okay, so two things. Where'd you get that number from? That's kind of rhetorical. You're saying
it's been estimated that there have been about 105 billion births since the dawn of human history.
Well, the consistent answer from the Christian position is that all people, including children, are fallen sons and daughters of Adam. They're sinners. We're born into the world with a bent towards sin.
So how is that compatible with morality or free will to create something flawed and then judge it flawed and then throw it in the trash?
Okay,
that's not consistent with any moral system.
Okay, for starters, I don't affirm free will probably like you're saying it. I'm a Reformed Baptist. So I'm a Calvinist. I don't affirm free will in the sense that you're probably thinking. But B, what was the second part of your question?
Well, I had another question about, so how is it, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought. I'm not sure what the second part was, but how is it a moral system to judge people not on moral actions, not even on sins and violations of the moral code, but judge them solely on what God they believe in? How's that a moral system?
That in and of itself is a sin. It's idolatry.
What is a sin?
Believing in other gods. It's called idolatry.
But that's not a moral sin. It's not going to hurt anyone. It's not.
Yeah, it does. It offends God.
Okay, well, that's pretty pathetic.
Well, I mean, says you. I mean, okay, so what?
He's supposedly the greatest being of all time, but he's offended that I don't believe in him while he's hiding from me. That doesn't seem to
But
comport with
he's
any that's why your position seems self-contradictory to me.
well, two things. So you're making yourself the standard, which is the first problem. The second thing is he hasn't hidden himself from you. So Romans chapter 1 says that all people know God exists. It's in a
Well, then
general
it's wrong because I
No.
don't know that. How
Well,
do you know that that's true?
because without it, you couldn't make sense of any of the dialogue that we're having. He's the necessary starting point.
We can still talk without ever hearing God. People talked and reasoned before Christianity existed.
Right. And I'm not saying that, again, this is what I was getting at with this is the evidence that people know that God exists. These transcendentals that we assume that you can't make sense of without God. So people, Romans 1, real quick, Romans 1 says that all people know God exists. It doesn't mean that they're walking around saying, I know Jesus Christ is God and I'm just not going to admit it. That's not what it is.
But I don't know that. So
Right.
how do you comport that with reality?
Couple minutes. Just let me finish on this because this will answer your questions. It says rather that everyone knows God exists because I'll use a term that you said earlier. It's self-evident that two things. He says through the creation and through the conscience, God has placed certain things within us such that we can know that he exists and we can look out at the creation and see that there's a designer. Now,
so why did someone have to tell you about it? You don't just know this. You had to be told about this.
No, Taylor. No one had to tell me don't rape women. It was intrinsically.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and it was intrinsically.
You can figure that out without God.
No.
So why did you need to be told about God and all this other stuff?
No, Taylor,
in order to figure that out.
Taylor. Let me finish. The evidence that you know God exists is because you're appealing to things that without him you can't make sense of. You've already admitted earlier. You already admitted earlier that the one thing that you know for certain you could be wrong about, which means that you don't actually know it.
No, I said the one thing was the law of non-contradiction.
Right. And then when I pressed you on it, you showed that actually you could be wrong. You said this could all be a simulation. That's what you said.
I'm not omniscient.
Right. So that shows that everything for the next 10 minutes now, you've made all sorts of knowledge claims. The evidence that you know God exists is the fact that you've done that. You've assumed things that without God, you wouldn't be able to assume.
Well, we have to assume it is until it's proven that it is necessary. So how is God necessary to logic? I'm still not seeing the bridge of that gap.
Right. And that's borrowing from God.
That's 10 minutes right there. All right, Miles, you got 10 more minutes to cross-examine Taylor.
Cool. Let's see. You said a personal God's will is simply not sufficient criteria to be objective. Where did you get that morality comes from simply God's will?
You're saying God is the foundation of all logic and morality.
Right, but you said that
it's not
right.
Good phrasing.
Right, but you essentially said that morality comes from simply his will, making it sound as though it's subjective to God said this is bad, this is not. This is bad, this is not.
Yeah, because otherwise then
but that's
the only alternative is he has reasons. He has reasoned to his position.
No, that's a false dichotomy because that's not what the Bible teaches.
Because he could be doing it for bad reasons. Immoral. He could be doing it for moral reasons, or he could be just total chaotic, neutral, total randomness.
Well, to even say that, you appealed to some standard outside of God, and I'd like to know where that standard came from, which I know. Well, let's not go down that path. Again, where in the Bible does it teach, or where does the Christian position, because when you said a personal God's will, I'm assuming for this debate, we're talking about Christianity. We're not talking about every other idea of God. You said that God's will is simply not sufficient criteria to be objective. And I'd like to know where the Bible teaches that morality comes simply from God's will, because that's not what the Bible teaches.
Well, I'd be willing to amend that as long as we can agree that you're saying that it comes from God.
Right, it does, but it's not simply God. When you say God's will, that makes it sound like what you're saying is God arbitrarily or just decided this is bad, this is not, and that's not the case.
Yeah, that would be subjective, and so I don't think a good all-knowing God would do that, I think he would have reasoned positions.
Right, but that's so again.
No,
Yeah, that's,
why he could explain to you, this is why I don't like murder. This is why I don't steal. This is why I don't like thieving.
he has in his word. That's what I'm saying. So the Christian position is not that murder is immoral because God's will. The
Yeah,
Christian
so he has
position,
reasons outside of just that God said it.
correct. It's linked to his ontos. It's by definition, immorality is that which is against God's nature. So is that
How
then
can we know that his nature is good?
because he's the standard of good.
How do we know that?
He is the objective standard. Because unless you, again, this goes back to, this is why we have to address all those things such as laws of logic, laws of thought, all those sorts of things. They're relevant to the debate because I would again posit that if you don't start there, you can't make sense of even asking that question. Because again, God is not somebody that you can reason to. He's somebody that you cannot reason without.
But I've been reasoning without God all my life.
Right, but that doesn't mean that doesn't thereby necessitate, okay, God doesn't exist. I agree that you reason. I'm saying,
but I didn't start with that position.
And I get that idolatry is popular, but what I'm saying is that you're doing these things that are inconsistent with what you claim to be standing on. I agree that you reason. I agree that you use logic. You're borrowing capital from my worldview. That goes back to the question earlier of you saying, I don't know that God exists. That's the evidence that you know he exists. You're evidencing that you're made in his image when you do those things, but it's inconsistent with what is coming out of your mouth.
So I'm not seeing any distinguishing features between claiming the Christian faith is the basis of all logic and any other religion that claims that.
And again, that isn't an argument for atheism, though.
But this is a debate about atheism. It's not about Christianity.
Correct. So saying, though, that I don't see how all the other religions in the world, it's like when people try and say, okay, I'm an atheist, but for the sake of the argument, I'm going to argue for the flying spaghetti monster. That doesn't help the case of atheism. Or when they say, oh, well, you're a Christian, well, you're one step further down the road than I am. You're an atheist to all the other gods. That doesn't help the atheistic position at all. That actually defeats your position. That's not support for atheism.
How?
Because it's not supportive of atheism. It's rather supportive of some other deistic worldview. It's just trying to dodge or shift the goalpost.
The fact that all the religions make the same arguments and you don't believe them, but you make a special exception for your religion, that doesn't give points to atheism?
Not at all. Because they don't all make the same claim. Show me any other worldview in the world that teaches that that God comes down to man and not the opposite, for one. And two, show me any other religion in the world that says that the rebel sinners, the creation, sets their own house on fire. They're in the house. They don't want anybody to come in and help them. They want to burn their own house down. The creator steps into his own creation. He goes in and saves a people out of the fire who are rebel sinners that don't deserve it. He does so perfectly and then saves them unto himself. Show me any other religion in the world that teaches that.
How does that go towards your position? That's just random theology. That doesn't show that it's more logical or more true than any others.
That's not the argument that I was making by saying that. You said that Christianity is no different than every other religion in the world. So I simply showed, yeah, it is.
Well, for that argument,
it's totally different.
For that argument you were making of God told me.
This is sidetracking. None of this has anything to do with, can atheism account for objective morality?
Yeah, it seems that we're sidetracked a little bit. Let's try to stay on subject with
So again, tell me one thing that you know to be objectively morally wrong, and how do you know it?
Non-existence.
How is that immoral? Is it always wrong for anyone, anywhere, at any time to rape women for mere personal pleasure?
Yes.
Says who?
Well, I could go through the logic again with you, but skipping forward a little bit, it's against the principles of freedom.
Okay, so what?
So I've reasoned to the position that freedom is a maximization of different existing positions.
And what if someone
potential
reasons? And what if somebody reasons to a totally different position? What if somebody reasons to the position, it brings me more pleasure and more enjoyment for me to be able to have sex with whoever I want to have sex with and act however I want to act, and that's the position that I've reasoned to? What if the majority of people reason to that position?
Well, that's really easy to demonstrate wrong because it produces mutually contradictory results. So one person says, well,
Okay, so they're
I
both
like it. The other person says, I don't like it. There's only one way to objectively solve that issue, and that's to have the same rules for each person.
okay. So who chose those rules?
No one chooses them.
Okay, then where did they come from?
Logic.
Okay, and again, now we're back in the same. See how the circle is vicious? So now we're back in the same position.
I mean, I can put back up the premises.
No, you can put those up, but it doesn't answer the question, because we have two people, one of which is saying they reason to one thing, and you're saying this is what's logical. What if the other person is saying, no, this is what's logical? You're appealing to an absolute standard and acting as though it's some ethereal thing off in the ether somewhere that's just kind of there and self-existent, almost like God. So my question again stands. How do you know that the person that says, I like to torture children because I get pleasure out of it, how do you know that that's wrong? Ultimately, objectively, always.
Because
it's always wrong no matter what.
Because it relies on a subjective standard, and so you can get
they said
different results.
Nope, they said that they reasoned to that through their logic.
Well, you can't, because I just showed that reasoning is invalid because you can get contradictory results from it.
Right, and they said the same exact thing, but it's just mirrored. What they said, they would say that what you're saying.
Yeah, people can be wrong in their arguments, though.
Yeah, and again, where's the standard of right and wrong?
I can say I reasoned to anything, but unless you have the premises in the actual logical format and each premise is valid, then you haven't really done your job.
Right, and so again, it's subjective. That's subjective. That's not objective.
Logic is not subjective.
I agree. But again, what you just said, another person could say the exact same thing and come to a totally different conclusion, and you don't have a standard to actually appeal to that is objective outside of yourselves.
Logic.
It's two people that are caught in a circle within themselves. There isn't a standard outside of yourselves.
It's logic.
Right, but again,
the logic will either change depending on someone's depending on who's using it, or the logic will be universally applicable.
So it's not objective, because you said it can change.
Well, there is invalid logic, and then there is valid logic.
Okay.
So what we're talking about is an objective system that doesn't change.
Right, and how do you determine that from your worldview? How do you determine that it's objective?
Well, because it gives the same result no matter which subject we pick, no matter if it's God, if it's the hobo, or if it's Donald Trump, or if it's you or me.
All right, that's 10 minutes for Miles. 10 more minutes for you, Taylor.
Okay. So I'm still not understanding. Can you connect how God is necessary to logic?
Because
just presupposing that he is the source of it. Like, how can you establish that?
Because in order to even do that, there's things that are assumed, and without God, you can't make sense of those things. So again, we're all in a circle. I agree that we're all in a circle. The difference is who's in a vicious circle and who's not. At a certain point, we all are in some sort of circular reasoning. The difference is I'm appealing to something outside of myself. You're not.
I'm appealing to logic, which is outside of myself. I don't.
Right, but in order to do that,
make this logic work.
Right, but in order to do that, you have to appeal to your senses. And you said earlier that this could all be a simulation.
Well, I actually didn't appeal to senses at all in any of my premises.
You didn't what?
I didn't appeal to senses at all in any of my premises.
Right, I know you didn't appeal to them, but you're using them. That's the point.
Not in the argument.
But right now, man, right now you're using your senses. You said earlier that you said earlier that this could all be a matrix. I asked one thing that you know for certain. You said that you appealed to the law of non-contradiction, but then said that this could all be a matrix, which means that the one thing you claim to actually know, you don't actually know, because if you knew it, you couldn't potentially be wrong about it. You know it.
No, because the Matrix still can't break the law of non-contradiction.
Right, but all of
Um,
your thoughts could simply be misfirings going off in your brain for all that you know.
and all of your conversations with God could be misfirings in your brain going on.
No, because again, for you to
People do
make
it
that
all the
claim,
time.
look,
You would
Taylor,
say that to a Muslim. Wouldn't you tell that to a Muslim?
you're standing on a platform. You're then imploring your platform to me, which is no.
What would you tell a Muslim who said, I have direct experience with God?
I would take that Muslim to the Quran and I would say, okay, do you believe that the Bible is a previous revelation from Allah, specifically the Injil, which is the Gospels, the Pentateuch, and the Psalms? They would say yes. I would then say, okay, do you believe that in Surah 6 or maybe Surah 9? I'd have to look up which Surah it is. I would say, do you believe that it says in Surah 6 or Surah 9 that previous revelations, or do you believe that the Bible is a previous revelation from Allah? They would say yes. I would say, do you believe in Surah 6 or Surah 9 that it says that the Bible is a previous revelation from Allah? They would say yes. And then I would say, do you believe that the Quran says later in Surah, ooh, I can't remember which one, but hypothetically speaking, let's just say it was Surah 10, because it does say it. I just can't remember which surah it is. I would say, do you believe that it says that the words of Allah cannot become corrupted? They would say yes. I would then demonstrate to the Muslim that, because the big point of contention between us and Muslims is that they don't believe Jesus is God. That is a central foundational difference between Christians and Muslims, and it is a deal breaker. It is a hill worth dying on. It is an essential truth to the Christian message. So I would then say, or go to the book of John or the book of Mark, and I would show them where, for example, Thomas fell down and bowed down before Jesus and said, "My Lord and my God," after seeing the holes in his hands of the risen Savior. He then worshiped him, and Jesus didn't rebuke him. Muslims believe, in their worldview, that Jesus was just a prophet. And they also taught that prophets would never receive worship because there's only one true God. Somebody who worships an idol in their religion is worthy of death.
They also think he's the Messiah.
Do what?
They also think he's going to eventually be the Messiah.
That irrelevant. I would then show them that Jesus was worshipped as God. At that point, 9 times out of 10, I have yet to see a Muslim that says anything different than this. So if they said something different, I don't know where the conversation might go because there's hypotheticals. But they would say,
were they hallucinating Allah?
No, they would say that the Injil has become corrupted. And I would then show them, okay, well, the surahs say that the Injil is a previous revelation from Allah. Because the Bible is true, the Quran therefore cannot be true. I would show them the inconsistency. But this is pointless to the debate of, can atheism account for objective morality? You keep wanting to shift the goalpost to other religions, which is pointless.
Because atheism stands against all religions. So they were wrong about their experience with God.
That's irrelevant.
So what you're saying is that we have to... Hold on, I'm asking a question.
Right, but you're not a Muslim, so there's no need to argue.
Yeah, I'm saying that all your positions are mutually contradictory.
Wrong. I just demonstrated the inconsistency of...
So what you're saying is you are able to reason to God. It's not just you feel it.
No, I'm not reasoning to God. I'm starting with
using reasoning to prove them wrong and to say that ours is correct.
Right, and I have a reason.
Their experience with God was a hallucination. I'm not sure what you would say to a Hindu saying that they had a direct experience with Krishna, or they saw one of their bodhis, or whatever they call them, performing miracles.
And none of this is in support of objective morality for atheism.
It's
if you want to debate,
demonstrating that you can't.
Hinduism, let's get on in a couple weeks. Marlon can set it up, and you can take the Hindu position, and then we'll go down the road of Hinduism. We can sit here and waste a bunch of time talking about other religions, and I can show you the inconsistencies. I've studied.
It's demonstrating your special pleading.
Competing world religions, man. I came out of Eastern religion. So we can talk about that all day, but that's irrelevant to objective morality. What does Hinduism and the falsehood of Hinduism and the Muslim faith have anything to do with morality in the atheistic worldview?
Because the argument you're hanging everything on is special pleading.
No, it's not special pleading. No, absolutely not. And even if it was, the atheistic worldview has no reason to that's inconsistent with your own worldview. There's no reason for special pleading to be wrong in an unguided, unpurposeless.
No, because logic still exists in my worldview.
But you can't even account for it, man.
I can.
You said earlier 2 things that you said earlier that totally refute that. That this could be a matrix, which means that the one thing you said that you're for certain on, you could be wrong about. And 2, your worldview can only account for the physical realm. Your worldview cannot account for transcendence like logic, things that exist outside of time, space, regardless of where you're at, when you live, etc.
Just regardless of whether we live in the matrix or not, I know all I need to know about logic is everything in logic stems from the law of non-contradiction.
And how do you know that?
So,
You just said earlier that you could
because
be
if
wrong.
something, if anything exists, whether it's a matrix or a hallucination or anything, something exists. It's kind of like I think, therefore I am.
Right.
We know at least that much.
Right. And to do that, how do you know that your reasoning faculties are working correctly? You could just
Well,
be,
we can follow. I mean, there are entire fields studying just logic.
yeah, and they're
I don't know
assuming
where to begin with that.
uniformity of nature and induction. They're using their senses to do it. Do you not see how that's a vicious circle, man? This is what happens with atheism, man. When you reject
But I
God,
don't-
you're reduced to futility.
I don't need senses or anything. I don't need to know that my senses are accurate
But your
to make
reasoning,
any of these arguments.
you're using your reasoning faculties to make these claims, man.
Yeah,
That's
so
the point.
which premise is
Right. So how
incorrect?
do you know that your reasoning faculties are working correctly? If you're
Because
just
if
a
the
product of
premises are
random
valid,
transmutations over millions, billions of years, your brain could just be feeding this information to you right now. That's what's consistent with your worldview, not what I profess.
and we can test our
And you
knowledge of
have to
reality,
you have to use
and
your
you have no
senses,
explanation for
and you have
why.
to use your senses and your reasoning faculties to do those things. That's the vicious circle. You're stuck inside yourself. You can never know if anything that you're claiming is actually true or accurate.
And your one argument
folly of what I was
argument that says that God is accurate relies on your senses.
And that's consistent with my worldview, not yours.
It's not
That's the
consistent with
difference.
reality, though.
But you could be, again, you're employing your reasoning faculties and your senses to say that. Anything that you say moving forward could be just misfirings going off in your
But
brain.
using your logic, I can just say, I know atheism is true. Logic imparted it to me.
Right, from
when I was
my
born.
worldview. That's consistent with my worldview. It's not consistent with your worldview.
But I could make that my worldview anytime I wanted.
So you'd abandon atheism then. So the debate tonight is over.
No. If I abandoned that,
I mean, it sounds like you already have, man, with Hinduism and Muslims and all this other stuff. And if you want to debate,
so the same
continue
reason
to
I
go-
don't believe them is the same reason I don't believe you. That somehow disproves atheism.
No, what disproves atheism is the fact that A, God says that all people know that He exists, but B, you've evidenced tonight
How
that
do you know you're
that you're
how do you
dependent
know you're
upon
reliably getting that information?
because God has said so.
Exactly. Special pleading.
The Word of God.
Other religions say God said this.
And I can show you the
So
inconsistencies.
it's an
of their-
invalid argument
and
that you're
again,
making.
no, and I can show you the inconsistencies of their worldview. Again, with like Muslims, for example, another
It
inconsistency.
doesn't matter if they're inconsistent. How can you tell me that yours is consistent if you can't even tell me you know? Well, you say you know, but you can't tell me how you know. You
So
just say
because
you do know.
So because I can't tell somebody, for example, how electricity works or gravity works, that means I can't know that it works.
Well, if you showed me a god, then you wouldn't have to tell me how it works. You could just show me that it exists. We can do that with electricity.
That's a red herring. That has nothing to do with what I was saying. You said that simply because I don't know how something is done, that means I can't know it.
All right, that's 10 minutes.
That specific one.
All right, that's 10 minutes is up for Miles. All right, next person. No, 10 minutes up for Taylor. Next person is Miles. Go for your final 10 minutes cross-examination.
Let's see. You said if God can give good reasons for His system, or He gives random or bad reasons, something along those lines. Sorry, I was trying to type a bunch of stuff really fast. But you said something about God. If God can give good reasons for His systems or give random and bad reasons, where are you getting your standard of good and bad from?
I'm using the English definition of good. So that is essentially referring to either, armor is good for protecting your body.
Right.
Or
okay. And
good being preferable to something else. So
why is that the standard?
Well, that's the word in English.
Right, but why is that the standard? Why somebody in English could have came up with it's good for us to kill all black people, or it's good for us to kill Jews, which people did in history. So why is because a committee or a company created a definition, or a society of people created that definition, why is that objectively good?
Well, you just described subjective good.
Okay, well, but you appealed to the dictionary definition. So I want to know, why is that the standard?
Yeah, so there's an objective interpretation of good, which
Okay,
is
where
simply
did that right? And where did that come from?
well, it's mine.
Well, then
So I'm deriving it from. It's consistent with
objective.
Yeah, so it's consistent with the definition, the
Yeah,
English definition of good, and so we're separate. All I'm doing is taking the subjective definition out of it. So all we're left with is the objective definition.
Okay, so did you hear yourself?
Yeah, I took subjectivity out of it, which is how you get objectivity.
Right, but not because you're appealing to yourself. You're the standard, is what you're saying. You're ultimately saying yes, because another person could come along and do the same thing you just did, but come to a totally different conclusion. There's nothing outside of yourselves.
And yet we could check the validity of that conclusion with logic.
Right. And okay. And this again goes back to the same dance that we were doing earlier, which I don't want to do. There's some other things that I want to get to. Let's see. You said theistic morality is subjective. So for the sake of this debate, we're talking about obviously Christianity. So you're saying Christian morality is subjective. Can you show somewhere in the Bible where the Christian position of morality is subjective?
Well, for example, when God orders genocide. But to be clear, Christian morality can be objective if you're saying that God reasoned to his positions. But if you're saying that it's just because that is God's nature, because it's God's will, that's what's subjective.
Okay, says who?
Logic.
Logic says that the
definition of objective applied to logic.
Of God's nature being immoral, logic says that is subjective.
Yes, if the answer changes depending on the subject, then it's subjective.
That is a non sequitur. That does not logically follow at all.
Yeah, it does. So if you take the premise of what objective means, or what subjective means, and then
objective means, in terms of morality, it's not influenced by personal feelings, interpretations, or prejudice.
Yeah, so
the Christian position of morality is that it has nothing to do with God's interpretation, his own personal feelings, or prejudice. It has to do with which is not his nature. So how is
I'm saying that there's a reason that his nature is a certain way. There's a reason he understands what good is and why.
Right, but that doesn't logically.
He could define it for us. He's not just going to say, "Well, just because I said so."
Right, and he does in his word. So when you said theistic morality is subjective, the Bible doesn't say that. So theistic morality is not, or Christian theism is not morally subjective.
Well, I'm not arguing from the Bible.
No, I know that, but you made the claim. You claimed theistic morality is subjective.
Yeah, so if it's based on an opinion or feeling of God,
it isn't.
Then it's subjective.
But it's not.
So then logic lies outside God.
That again is a non sequitur. That doesn't logically follow at all.
No, because he can't change his positions, can he?
What do you mean?
He's locked by logic. He's not going to suddenly decide that rape is good. There's a reason he's not changing his position. There's a reason it went there in the first place.
This is why I asked if you know what ontos is. It's not that he's locked by logic. Logic is merely a reflection of who God is. God is logical. God is not illogical. God can't make a square circle. God can't make a rock.
Can he choose to be something else?
What do you mean by choose to be something else?
Can he choose to change his nature?
I mean, that's illogical. No.
Right.
So logic is a reflection of his
He's
mind.
Locked.
No, it's
his current positions.
That's his ontos. It's his being. It's like saying, Taylor, so because you can't become a bird, that means therefore that you are not logical. That's essentially what you're saying. Because God can't change his nature, therefore he's illogical?
There are reasons outside of me and my mind that I can't become a bird, and there are reasons outside of God that he can't change his nature.
Right. No, it's not reasons outside of himself. This again goes back to God's ontos. That's what he is. I don't know why. I mean,
you're just saying that and you can't demonstrate it or even reason to it.
Right, because in order to even reason, Taylor, you have to presuppose God.
No.
That's the whole contention of what I was saying earlier.
No. Entire civilizations have reasoned without presupposing God.
And they're made in God's image, and that's exactly why they can. Romans 1 talks about that. People suppress the truth in their unrighteousness. They lift up other worldviews, other so-called gods, in suppression of the God that they do know, because it ultimately comes down to the fact that they love their sin. And so they try and lift up other worldviews, other ideologies, and little do they know they're actually borrowing from God in order to do those things. You haven't
if you
acted,
just claim that you have dominion over logic, which anyone can do.
Do what?
If you just claim you have exclusive dominion over logic, which anyone can do for any worldview.
Right, but God doesn't just merely claim it.
Where is he then?
What do you mean, where is he?
Why doesn't he come down and tell us himself?
He did.
Why does he need you?
He did. And he didn't. He doesn't need me. Absolutely not. He has through multiple means. He has through the person of Jesus Christ. And
then
Jesus
why
Christ,
is his failure rate over 99% for conversion?
What do you mean his failure rate? So that question.
All of humanity, most people have not been Christians, have not even had the chance to be Christians.
Right.
And right now, most people are not Christians.
So what?
So why is your God's failure rate so high?
That's not a failure.
If you're saying he's placed it on our hearts, he's communicating with us, do most people are completely unaware of this?
So two things. The Christian position, and again, we're getting off into rabbit trails, which is away from, you have the affirmative. You're affirming this debate is not about Christian morality, or can the God of the Bible, is he a moral monster, anything like that. But I will answer the question. So two things. There's a general revelation of God, which he's placed in all people, in our conscience, in our heart, and he's given us the word. There is a special revelation that he's given to believers. Your question assumes that God is trying to save all people, and he fails in doing so. I don't affirm that position. The Bible doesn't affirm that position.
Then
I believe God, no. According to
then you have no moral system.
Again, nope, you're appealing to a standard of evil that you can't account for. It's subjective, and you're saying the God of the Bible is a moral monster because whatever. And my question to that would be, so what? God's not trying to save everybody. God's going to be glorified in the demonstration of his justice, mercy, grace, love, wrath, all his attributes. God will be glorified in the demonstration of his just punishment towards sinners, and he'll be glorified in the salvific work of saving those whom he sent his son to pay the penalty for.
But he doesn't punish sinners. He only punishes disbelievers.
Which are sinners.
But he doesn't punish most sinners, or he doesn't punish the sinners that get into heaven. So it has nothing to do with sin.
Right, because sin
he's only punishing the one sin of blasphemy against the Holy Spirit.
No, he's not. Sin is a legal problem. So sin is equated to legal debt. So sin is the transgression of God's law. It's a legal problem. And he does punish for my sin and all the people who he saves. He did punish them for their sin. He punished Jesus Christ on the cross. So legal debts can be transferred. So I believe in penal substitutionary atonement. Jesus paid the penalty that I deserve. He paid the penalty that every other person who believes will deserve. My sin was atoned for that way. It wasn't that God just winked and it disappeared.
All right, that's 10 minutes is up. All right, Taylor Gray, you have your final 10 minutes to cross-examine Miles.
Okay, so you value consistency in your worldview, right?
Absolutely. I believe God is most glorified when we are consistent.
So there is no consistency to the punishment method. There's no consistency to allowing anyone to exist before salvation was even an option, and there's absolutely no consistency in punishing based solely on essentially a trivia question, is whether or not you were convinced by this specific religion, and it's over 99% unconvincing.
Absolutely not. That's absolutely not. That's not what the Bible teaches.
How is that not inconsistent?
Because that's not what the Bible teaches. It's a straw man.
That's what you said this entire debate.
Sounds good, but that's not what the Bible teaches. Nowhere did I say that that salvation is based on a trivia question. Nowhere.
That's how I characterize it.
Right. I know that you. Right. That's how you characterize it. That's a straw man. It's a caricature. That's not what the Bible teaches. That's not what I believe. So
what is the moral weight of believing in a God? It amounts to a trivia question.
Absolutely.
How am I a less moral person than you just because I have a different God than you?
Because you're an idolater. That's why.
Why is that immoral?
Because God said so.
Right. Because God said so is all you have, but you can't even back up. Well, how do you know that God is reliable?
I'm trying to finish. But let me break it down this way. Let's say this. The Christian position is this. It's not based on simply a trivia question. Here's the Christian framework. We're all working in a system. That's why I kept trying to go back to platforms. So if you let me finish just 2 minutes, and then I'll let you respond. Well, let me finish this whole thing so I don't lose my train of thought. The Christian position is this. You and I are both sinners before God. The framework is that we are in rebellion against God. We don't want anything to do with God. God is going to allow many people to essentially, he'll give them enough rope to hang themselves with. C.S. Lewis, I think, said it that the gates of hell are locked from the inside. God doesn't have to force anybody to go to hell. And your question seemed to assume almost that all these people want God, but God just doesn't draw them to himself. And that's not the Christian position. The Christian position is that all people are fallen sons and daughters of Adam. They're in rebellion to God, and God chooses out of his kindness to be merciful to some. It isn't a matter of getting a trivia question right. It isn't a matter that's not at all what it is. You have a stony heart that needs changed. You have a heart that needs turn towards God, or you'll never turn to Christ. I know that you'll never believe unless the Spirit of God miraculously does a work within your heart. That's the Christian position, is that the Spirit saves who the Spirit will save. And it's my job to merely proclaim the message, and God will do what God is going to do. Now, if you want to say that that's immoral, or that's this, or that's that, I mean, you're fine to say that. You have every right to say that, but it really holds no weight because it's subjective. It's not objective.
So there's no free will then, is there?
Well, it depends what you mean by free will. So I'm a compatibilist, if you know what compatibilism is. But I don't hold free will in the traditional American Christianity sense of God's done all that he can do. Now the ball's in your court, and it's up to you now to make the choice. That's not historic Christianity.
So how is it consistent to say that you have a stony heart and you need to burn in hell because you don't have the right God? How does that?
That's not why. You deserve hell because you're a sinner. You've broken the law of God. It's a legal problem. So if I were to go out, for example, and murder somebody tonight, the law
he made us sinners.
The law requires that I be punished for that. God is just. It's part of his nature. So
my argument is your system circumvents any justice system at all and just gives a get out of jail free card to anyone who happens to just get lucky and be born into your religion.
Absolutely not. And it's not being born into the religion. No one's born into Christianity. Everybody that's a Christian was saved by the power of the Holy Spirit.
Then how come most Christians are raised by Christians and people who aren't raised by Christians tend not to be Christians?
That's the genetic fallacy. That's a false equivalency.
That is not the genetic fallacy.
Absolutely. Saying that somebody's going to be a Christian because they were born. That's saying that the engine is blue because the car is blue.
Yeah, it seems that we're venturing off subject again. Let's try to get back on subject, please.
So if we're so your one argument for the reliability of your senses is unreliable because you can apply it to any other religion, any other claim or position, and you get false positives. So how is your claim that you know of God, how is that any different?
Well, I've demonstrated already, for example, with the Muslim, but that doesn't help atheism. We need to approach it from the position of atheism. You're standing on a platform that ultimately says all of this is random chance. It sprung up out of nowhere. It's an unguided, purposeless cosmos. You haven't acted at all during this debate. Like gravity may just turn off at any moment and you could float to the ceiling. You've assumed certain things. You've appealed to logic, but you haven't demonstrated that atheism can even account for immaterial, abstract transcendentals like logic, rationality, etc. And you admitted earlier.
So can you demonstrate for me why God is necessary for all of that without just assuming that it is, because your God that you were raised with.
Okay, so do you see that in that question we'll assume certain things?
Assume what?
Would you agree with that? Well, you're assuming right now that my words are going to mean something 5 minutes from the same. You're assuming that my words right now meant the same thing 5 minutes ago. So you're imploring induction. You're imploring that you're assuming that your senses are working properly right now.
Why is that
actually hearing me.
exclusively under the purview of your religion?
Well, it's not exclusively under my religion. It's exclusively to my worldview in terms of consistency. So again, I'm not saying that you're not imploring those things. You are. It's just inconsistent with what is coming out of your mouth about what you believe about the world.
Well, it's inconsistent with reality because we know that you and I could both have an incorrect experience with God or any God.
And in order to do that, Taylor, you're using your senses. And you've already said earlier that your senses could be wrong.
So what I'm saying is we have to be able to reasonably separate what are hallucinations and what aren't. And we already have to do that whether God's real or not. Okay, whether your God is true or not.
And again,
do you agree? Don't you agree?
Again, you're making claims right now.
Well, do you agree that we have to be able to reason away bad explanations for God and reason to what you're saying? You are reasoning it.
Right, but it's consistent with my worldview. What I'm standing on, that's consistent. It's not.
And logic is consistent with my worldview.
Absolutely not. You haven't explained at all where it came from, and you haven't explained
it comes from existence itself.
So
I've explained this.
If I said that about God, you would laugh. You would say that's not an argument. Come on, man.
Right, because you can't connect the dots. I can.
No, you can't.
Yeah, I can.
Here's
the fact I gave you an ought from an is.
No, here's the
universe ought to exist because the alternative is logically impossible.
Here's been the train of things. You said earlier, I asked you, what is one thing that you know? You told me you appealed to the law of non-contradiction. You then, mere minutes later, maybe seconds later, said that actually I could be wrong. This could all be a simulation right now.
Not about the law of non-contradiction.
We've been on here for an hour and 42 minutes. And you have since then made all sorts of knowledge claims and truth claims. That right there is the evidence, my friend, that you know that God exists. You're mirroring his image. You're trying to be consistent. You're trying to be rational. You're trying to be logical. That is what Romans 1 talks about when it says that all people know God because they're made in his image. You're not a piece of protoplasm. You're not a piece of random chance stardust over billions of years.
Can you demonstrate why God is necessary to that equation without just saying God exists and therefore?
I didn't say he exists therefore. I said because without him, you wouldn't even be able to make sense of your question.
Why?
Because I've just demonstrated it again.
No, you haven't answered why.
Because it assumes things like induction, the reliability of your senses.
And you're assuming that is only possible through your God. Why?
Because you have to start with him in order to make sense of your question.
Why?
Why do birds fly? I mean,
why do you have to start with God?
Because
I don't have to. I can reason without God.
No, you not consistently. You can't because what you're claiming to stand on is not consistent with what you're claiming.
So why do you need to start with God?
Because if you don't start with him, Taylor, you can't account for all these other things.
Yeah, I can because I can account for the law of non-contradiction and therefore all of logic without assuming God.
The platform you're standing on says that all of this is a random chance cosmic accident. And you've said that your brain...
I've actually said to assume that God exists in this debate.
You've said what?
I've said to assume that God exists and evolution is false in this debate because that is irrelevant to any of my arguments. My argument stands whether God exists or not.
It's not
because I'm saying that the way that we get to morality is the same way that God would do it if he was a good God.
Absolutely. Oh, and again, when you say if he was a good God, you're assuming a standard of good that you can't account for. It's subjective. It's not objective. You've just asserted it.
All right, that ends the 60-minute cross-examination portion of this debate. So now we're going to closing statements, and we'll start with who went first to open the statements? It was Taylor. Right?
Yeah, I can go.
All right, we'll go with Taylor for closing statements.
Not sure. Maybe we can have some extra time for questions or something because I think this will be fairly short since I've already presented, like the very
Yeah,
detailed version.
we're going to do questions after the closing statements.
Okay.
Then you guys got a whole bunch of questions, so I'm gonna limit the time so we go
Cool.
through the questions. There's a whole bunch of them. So, all right, go ahead, go for it, Taylor.
Okay, so I'll try to kind of summarize it as quickly as possible. So, the fact that we're even arguing presupposes logic in the first place, and as I've said numerous times, we can logic and reason without assuming God, and presumably the argument behind that is, well, sure, you can do that, but logic itself wouldn't exist in the first place without God. And I've yet to hear an explanation of why that's necessary. And as I was just saying, I can account for the law of non-contradiction without God, so that is atheism, and using only the principle of existence and non-existence. And from there, I can account for all of logic, since we have the law of non-contradiction. And from there, well, with every logical system that is valid, that is, the premises are valid, and thus the conclusion follows, there is an imperative to follow that logic, or else you are breaking that logic, and thus, for any ethical system that is logical, if you're breaking that, that is defined as immorality. And so what I'm attempting to do here is to use the definitions that we already have and take away the subjectivity to get to good, because good and bad are basically the main tenets of a moral system. What is good or bad? But I think maybe we're caught up on the semantics of it, because we don't even have to use the terms good and bad. It's just an ethical system gives you behaviors that you should and should not do. So with any logical system, we have an imperative to follow that system, or else you are being illogical and thus incorrect. So if we have a objective moral system, if you're violating that, you are incorrect. There's not going to be a bolt of lightning that comes down and strikes you and prevents you from doing that incorrect thing, just like you can write 2 + 2 = 5, but it doesn't make sense and you'd be incorrect. So we didn't really get too much into this, which I was a little bit hoping for, but I had fun anyway, that we would get into exactly how that would be applied in the real world. So from the definition of good, we can apply that to the first ought from an is. So that is non-existence. So existence is good because that is the fundamental ought, the fundamental should of the entire universe, because something exists. So using that and the fact that there's an imperative with any logical system, we can basically create an ethical system around what kind of existences should exist. So what we're going to do is to see what kind of existences can be logically and basically, which is consistently applied. And so we can do that with things like freedom. And the way that we check this is basically the argument from the impossible alternative. So if we have an ethical system that says murder is okay, then you're going to go around and, well, society's going to fall apart, and you're going to essentially have some people who are allowed to murder and some people who aren't allowed to murder. That's how we know might does not equal right, because the rules change depending on who's in charge. So that's not objective, that is subjective. And depending on the framework that you use for your Christian system, it could be objective or subjective. And all I'm saying is that God is correct for correct reasons if he is a good God. So therefore, he's using logic. And we can use that logic too, because that logic doesn't change whether we're God or another person. Now, there is this problem of, how do you even know your logic is correct? How do you even know anything is correct? Well, assuming that we're living in some sort of simulation in the matrix, we can still know things about this matrix. And again, that doesn't really affect any of my arguments of like from non-contradiction, because these are moral arguments and not material arguments. Because so if we were in the matrix, physics could be wrong, but we would still know something about the physics of the matrix for sure. I wanted to get into this a little bit, but I'm sure you understand how the scientific method works. First, we make assumptions and hypotheses, and then we go and test that. And those that pass the test and those that can make predictions, that becomes science. So we can reliably do that with a lot of different things, especially logic, and it works. We don't have to know exactly why it works all the time, but that is an important question. How do we know we're correct? And I have yet to hear a cogent response for how, my opponent criticizes my ways of knowledge. And yes, I don't have 100% knowledge of everything, and we should all be able to admit that. And yet that's good enough to make knowledge claims about the world. That's good enough for us to do physics. That's good enough for us to do science. And it's good enough for us to do logic. And we still get correct results. If we're living in the matrix, I can still build a bicycle. I can still build an airplane within this matrix. I can still make logical assumptions. I can still do mathematics, and it still works. So under this framework, how does my opponent know that his assumptions are reliable? He hasn't put them to the test. And using that same logic, if we apply it to any other claim, especially any other religious claim, it falls apart completely. And he demonstrated this pretty perfectly. It gives you false positives. Anyone can say, I have direct experience with God, and you can find little things to nitpick about that specific religion. And I didn't go into too much with Christianity, although I did show how the system of damning 50 billion children to burn in hell for all of eternity, that is planned into the system. God had total foreknowledge of this. He made them that way so he could punish them. And this is absolutely internally inconsistent. This is totally subjective morality. God would not accept this kind of treatment if someone else was doing it to him. So what it all comes down to is we can reason without God, and God has reasons if he's correct. So the spiel, and I suppose we'll just get to the questions then. Thank you.
All right. So thank you, Taylor, for that closing statement. All right, Miles, you got it. 10 minutes.
Cool, thanks. He started off by saying the fact that we're arguing presupposes logic, and that's exactly the point, everybody. The point of the entire debate is that things were assumed from the other position, and that's why in my opening statement I said 3 different times that we're all standing on a platform. Neutrality is a myth. Everybody has a platform that they're standing on. He didn't want to talk about evolution, which I get it. The debate was not on evolution, but it's relevant to the debate because it's part of the platform that Taylor was standing on. And then what we heard come out of his mouth for almost 2 hours was completely inconsistent with what he was standing on. Anybody can go on his YouTube channel and see in his videos what he professes to believe about the world. And it's inconsistent with what he claims to be standing on. I was trying to take notes. It was hard to keep up with so many of the things. There were a ton of unfounded presuppositions. He said in this, why is my question would be, why is existence preferred to non-existence? Why is having more quantities of qualities preferred over the opposite? So many misrepresentations of God. He said, again, he appealed to a standard of good outside of God, that God damning 50, and again, I don't know where he's getting this number from, but even so, the appeal to emotion to say that God created, which again is biblically inaccurate, but God created 50 billion babies specifically to send them to hell. He created them damned. Again, that's just theologically and biblically inaccurate. But more so, what's more important is we didn't hear a case tonight for objective morality. We heard a lot of shaking the fist in God's face, saying, I won't have you to rule over me. We see a lot of Adam and Eve syndrome. I'm going to be my own God. I'm going to choose what's right and wrong. It's ironic that Taylor's YouTube channel is called Snake Was Right. I'd like to know by what standard the snake was right. But we see a lot of that same thing. I'm not going to have you rule over me. And we saw a bunch of subjectivity. I didn't hear anything tonight about atheism being able to account for objective morality. I heard a lot of philosophical lingo. I heard a lot of talk about logic and a bunch of things that are not consistent with the platform that he claims to stand on. And so again, I would ask the viewer to analyze what was coming out of both of our mouths and see if what we were standing on was consistent with that. Because I would argue that a lot of what Taylor said tonight just simply wasn't consistent with what he professes to believe about the world. When we talked about, unfortunately, the small amount of morality, we didn't really get into much about, certain atrocities. But even in his closing statement there, he said that he acted as though God damning 50 million people is an atrocity or some sort of evil. Yet in an atheistic worldview, that's just what happens. That's what happens in an unguided cosmos. Survival of the fittest, natural selection. That stuff like that happens all the time in his worldview. Yet he acted like that was some sort of problem. And that is what the Word of God means when it says that all people know that he exists. It's not this idea of I know Jesus is God and I'm just not going to say it. It's you evidence that you're made in his image when you open your mouth and speak. You evidence that you know God exists when you assume things like logic, rationality, consistency, law of non-contradiction, all of these things that atheism cannot account for. We didn't hear anything tonight. I was really hoping that we would hear a case tonight made for how atheism accounts for these things. Again, we heard a bunch of philosophical lingo and we heard a bunch of assertions. But again, the definition that I found of objectivity was completely different than the definition that he presented to us. And I never heard the answer on that. I know I didn't ask, but according to dictionary.com, it's not objectivity is not influenced by personal feelings, interpretations, or prejudice, but based on facts. That's not what we didn't hear any of that tonight. Everything that Taylor said tonight was based on personal bias. It was something that he simply didn't like. And he tried to say, oh no, I'm appealing to logic. But again, that goes back to the platform that he's standing on. We never heard how atheism can actually account for something such as logic. And with that, Marlon, I'll concede the rest of my time because I want to have enough time to get into some questions. I know you said that there were a lot of questions, so.
Yes, they are. All right. So thank you too for the closing statements. All right. So the first question we have is, and you'll see them on the screen. So this is just not me reading them.
Okay.
All right. Joshua Dougal. I think it's Dougal. I think I pronounced it. I don't want to destroy anybody's last name out there. So it's not my intentions to do that. Question for Miles. If morality reliant on the Bible, if morality is reliant on the Bible, why do the happiest countries in the world tend to be those that are the least religious?
So that is a category error. Morality has nothing to do with happiness. We could have a society of people like, Nazi Germany that were completely happy with executing what they considered to be less than human Jews. That didn't make it morally acceptable. So it's a category error. All
right. Any thoughts on that, Taylor?
I think it's pretty obvious. So they don't have their guilt complexes and all the nonsensical rules that go along with religions. And so they're free to exercise logic without having the dogma intrude.
All right. Next question. This one's for you, Taylor. He said morality evolves. So all his standard of morality can be wrong in the future. That's a question. As a result, all his criticisms of the Bible can be wrong.
So what I was talking about is the philosophical morality that I was arguing for does not evolve. That is objective. It stays the same throughout time and space, no matter what. There is the theory of how morality evolved in the theory of evolution, and those moral foundations they make sense in terms of evolution, but they're not necessarily cogent. They're done out of convenience, and that's how we get our moral intuitions. But it doesn't mean that it's logically valid. And so, what I'm advocating for is the philosophical, logically valid type of morality, which does not evolve.
All right. Any thoughts on that, Miles?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly my point. There's no objectivity there. By definition, objectivity would be transcendent. It wouldn't change. It would be set in stone over time. It wouldn't be something that, whether we're evolving to understand it or know it, even if we're not, even if he's saying that we evolve to understand it, that in and of itself is assuming things that, again, atheism can't account for.
All right. Another question for Mr. Taylor. If you ask Miles, quote, how do you know that, unquote, close quote, then you're assuming there is a standard to know if his answers are right or wrong. What gives you that standard?
What gives me that standard? My ability to reason, I guess, and logic. I mean, you're going to hear that a lot. But we have to have some standard of reasoning, right? Otherwise, we're just going to go around believing whatever God some street preacher tells us to.
All right. Any thoughts on that, Miles?
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially what I was trying to get at tonight, and try and kind of show the folly of what happens when, I mean, that's what happens when you reject God. I mean, that's what the Bible says. You're reduced to futility. You're reduced to thinking, oh man, I could be a brain in a vat right now. But then you don't live that way. So, yeah, I mean, that question is exactly the point I was trying to press tonight.
All right. Another question is for you, Miles. Can you explain your view of free will, what it comes from, how it works, etc.? And do you believe Taylor can believe in any sense of free will?
Okay, so to answer the first part, I'll try and give a cliff notes. If you want to know further about what I believe, just look up the compatibilistic view of free will. But essentially what I believe about free will is that human beings have not autonomous or libertarian free will. God has libertarian free will. We have a will that is enslaved. So we're going to make choices that are consistent with our nature. And unless that nature is freed, we're going to continue to go down the path that we want to go down, which is a bent towards sin, being fallen sons and daughters of Adam. So, for example, I can make choices consistent with my nature. So I can't fly, for example, because I'm not a bird. That's not part of my nature. And do you believe Taylor can believe in any sense of free will? I don't believe that it's a twofold question. I don't believe that Taylor can believe for a number of reasons. I believe that Taylor doesn't want to believe. For one, I believe the Bible teaches that Taylor actually loves his sin more than he loves God. And so he's going to continue to go down that path, and God's going to allow him to do so. And so I believe that Taylor will not turn to Christ unless God first changes Taylor's heart and then causes him to have new desires. And when the Spirit of God moves upon a person and changes their heart, that person then makes the choice to turn to Christ in faith and repentance.
All right. Any thoughts on that, Taylor?
I think it's interesting you would characterize us as enslaved to God.
No, I said enslaved to sin. Sorry, Marlon, but
okay. It's interesting God would make us that way. But I don't really think that there is free will. I think it's I don't think we can define it. I don't think there's any definition that is coherent. It doesn't really make any sense. I would like to believe in free will, and I would like to believe in God even. That is actually, there is nothing more in this entire world I would rather believe in. So I just can't be convinced because it doesn't make any sense. It has nothing to do with loving sin. I don't even know what that would mean. I don't even believe in God, so I can't choose something over God. It's like choosing kayaking over unicorns. I can't do that. I don't believe in unicorns.
All right. This is for you, Taylor. Is it always wrong for anyone to torture babies merely for pleasure?
Simple answer, yes. And I would derive that from the principle of freedom and, consistently applying that.
All right. Any thoughts on that, Miles?
Yeah, I would say that essentially, hey, what's up, John Wilkinson? I would say that essentially leads to an infinite regress, because I would then ask Taylor where he got that standard from, and we would just continue going and going and going and going and going down the path, because it's viciously circular.
All right. Question for Taylor. Why do Taylor believe only his logic is correct? Is Taylor infallible?
Well, if you know anything about logic is a procedure, and I used that procedure with all of my premises. So what I did was take premises that I thought they could be established as valid. At the base of it, you have to take self-evident premises, which is something exists, and the law of non-contradiction. And so I can derive premise after premise validly from that, and then if I can derive a conclusion from those valid premises. And that's how all logic is done. And that's why I put up my premises, in the hopes that someone could point out exactly where my logic fails, because it is all in logic format. Everything I've argued today, I put up on the screen in formal logic format.
All right. Any thoughts, Miles?
Without, beating a dead horse and saying the same thing that I said in the debate, I would just again point back to the fact that he said that he could be wrong about, I asked for one thing that he knows he could be right on. And when pressed on it, he said, well, we could just be in a simulation, or we could be in the Matrix or something like that.
But not my fundamental premises.
Sure.
All right. I'm going to go with two more questions. All right, Miles, this is for you again. Joshua asking, how is the Christian God moral when you said basically God only cares about certain people? Can an atheist be moral? Can a Christian be immoral?
Okay, so the first part, how is the Christian God moral when you said basically God only cares about certain people? So that question has underlying assumptions behind it, that if God doesn't extend grace to all people, it's assuming that grace can be demanded. According to the Bible, grace cannot be demanded because, without going down a big theological path, grace cannot be demanded because God doesn't have to care for anybody. When we hear, for example, in Romans 9, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated, we shouldn't be surprised when it says Esau I hated. We should actually be surprised that it says Jacob I loved. So the question assumes a standard outside of God that the person cannot account for. Can an atheist be moral? Absolutely. That's why I tried to say in my opening statement, I don't believe that atheists can't be moral. The point of the debate tonight, and my point, was that it's inconsistent. It's not being consistent with what they profess. They profess one thing that's a foundational thing, but then when it comes down to, is torturing babies wrong, they say yes. That's inconsistent with the platform they stand on. So my argument is inconsistency. And can a Christian be immoral? Yeah, and absolutely. But there would be caveats to that. There's a lot of nuance to that question. So I would ask what he means by that, because a true born again Christian has had a change of heart. Now that doesn't mean that person's not going to fall and backslide into sin. But it means that their desires are now different. So if somebody's claiming to be a Christian, yet they have no problem stealing things, cheating on their spouse, stuff like that, I would say that what Jesus said, that the fruit that they're bearing is rotten, and they should be marked as an unbeliever.
So if an atheist can be moral, why aren't they judged on that standard? Because the only standard that I can see that is actually being used to make the decision is faith in God. And
no,
you're essentially saying it only matters if they believe, and somehow idolatry is worse than all the other sins. It outweighs them completely, and it's the only unforgivable one.
No, they're judged on sin.
All right. Last question from Anthony Smith. Question for Tyler. If his thoughts are products of evolution, how does he have freedom if things are predetermined by physical processes happening in his brain?
So freedom is just the number of potential positions that a system can hold, and that's essentially it. If you can make these different decisions, if you have all these different options available to you, that is freedom. And doesn't really matter if your brain already is programmed to like mint ice cream, you still have the freedom to choose. And what that also means is that other people have the freedom to choose. And thus this system is more consistent over more systems.
All right. Thoughts on that, Miles?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, that's going to conclude our questioning portion of this debate. And that's going to conclude the debate. So thank you guys for coming on and jumping on here and expressing your positions in such a cordial way, being gracious towards each other and respectful. That's always wanted here on the Gospel Truth. I appreciate you and thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Even though it was a redo.
All right. And also, as I always do with first-time contestants on this show, debating, I send gifts. So I'll be reaching out to you too to get the contact information or address to send that gift to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Marlon. Anytime you want to, not to invite myself or extend the invite, but anytime you want to have me back, I'd be happy to come back.
Definitely. Same invite to you as well, Snake.
Yeah, same. I'm down.
Well, so just keep your calendars open for me.
Maybe next time we can debate the existence of God. That's a broader umbrella. So then we can get into more areas. So.
Speaking of invites, Andrew Rappaport was also viewing this debate and
troublemaker.
He wants to see if you guys would be willing to come on his show. Not necessarily, probably. I don't think he mean for like a formal debate or anything like that, but to discuss this debate. To see if you two would be willing to just come on and just, chop it up, have a conversation about the debate, to follow up on some of the questions that you guys both have after this debate,
Is he talking about tonight?
Not tonight. I'm sure.
Okay. And he's talking about on Striving for Eternity?
Yeah, for Apologetic Live with him and Matthew.
Oh, on a Thursday?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Well, he should have my Facebook contact info. So yeah, I'd definitely be down with that if Taylor's down with it.
Okay. Yeah, for sure. You can give my email or anything. Or if anyone wants to, it's just thesnakewasright@gmail.com.
Okay. Cool. Sounds good, fellas. Well, I'm gonna close this out. Thank you guys once again for coming on. And once again, I'll be contacting you for those gifts and have a good night, man. Appreciate y'all.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. Well, that is the Gospel Truth Show for tonight. A fantastic debate, another one in the books. And, I always appreciate all the viewers that jump on here, all the questions, it just adds to the fun and the love of debating. This central subject is an important subject. And as you know, on the Gospel Truth, we are engaging the culture of Christian truth. And in that, we do that through interviews, debates, and Bible lessons that I give. I record videos and post Bible lessons. So, it's all about that salvation, man. The gospel truth, obviously the title is emphasizing the gospel. If there's anyone out there who is viewing this debate and is starting to ponder, maybe God is starting to work on your heart. I just want to emphasize that Jesus Christ bled and died on the cross of Calvary. He was buried for 3 days, resurrected on the third day with all power in his hands. And he is our Lord and Savior. He is the Messiah. He is God incarnate in flesh. And he died for our sins. And it's important that you believe that. Believe on the truth of the gospel, that he is coming back for his people and he saved his people from sin, his elected people from their sins. So I just pray that you're one of those elect, that God is speaking to your heart and God draws you out of your sin and calls you to his glorious and wonderful salvation. So I pray that this debate was a blessing, and I pray that this debate will be used for the glorification of God. But with that, I do want to rehash the upcoming my upcoming let me share that real quick. My upcoming announcements. So I have coming up November 4th, I have Rail Laster. He'll be debating Ricky Roldan, and they'll be debating which worldview hinders presuppositions. And the big one coming up, I have Matt Slick debating Tom Jump, and they're going to be debating this November 6th. They're going to be debating, is there any reason to believe in God? This is going to be a good one. I hope you guys mark your calendars, cut your notification bells on, all that good stuff, so you don't miss out on that one. I have also November 19th, 2019, I have Alex D debating Mark Stanley. And then the question is, why I am and why I am not a Christian. And that's going down November 19th, as I said, 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So mark your calendars for that. And also I have Mr. Dr. Yancey coming on, George Yancey coming on, and he'll be talking to me about discrimination against Christians in academia. You know, and he's one of the only doctors in this field, that's studying this. And then the interesting is that he works at a secular college, and this is his forte. So it'll be interesting to hear what he has to say with this subject matter. So I hope you guys be able to share, like, follow, cut your notification bells on so you don't miss a show, and be on the lookout. This is just the first this is just the last 4 shows that are coming up. So mark your calendars, please. Would you please? So with that said, I'm going to get on out of here. It's been a long night. And as you can hear, my voice is sort of worn out. I'm just now getting over a cold. I swallowed some NyQuil earlier this morning when I got home from work, and my voice is still trying to repair itself. So, but with that said, I want to thank you for joining me on this episode of The Gospel Truth. May God bless you, and may God keep you. I'm out.